slide with that. Okay, folks, for those of you that are watching, we will be going live in about a minute and a half. Here, this is going to give me feedback. Deep breath.
Ready?
Hang on. Let's see, that is on. We are streaming now. Perfect streaming, that's what it says. Oh, I see. Okay, as soon as we see it go to there. Good. Okay, folks, it's a little bit after 11:30. So this is Steve Dale with the Golden State Pool Trust, and this is part of our MCLE series here. And so for those of you that are new to this, here, if you're interested in getting notices about our CLE program, and we have a pretty robust program coming up, please email Shelley, SHELLEY, at gspt.org, and we'll make sure we put you on the list. Also, if you're interested, we do have a listserv where we post other information from time to time. And part of the reason that we do these programs for the Golden State Pool Trust is that a lot of our work is working with attorneys who do work with special needs trusts here. And what we're trying to do is present them with top-notch education on a wide variety of subjects having to do with special needs trusts and serving persons with disabilities here. Today our subject is going to be is on MSAs, and for those of you that do work with special needs trusts, especially with first-party work, this is something you absolutely need to understand. Okay, and this has been an area that's been going on for a number of years, and it's one of the most confusing areas, I think, of special needs trust planning that I know of. But Joe's going to explain to us, and this is Joseph Anderson here with MetaVest. How long have you been with MetaVest?
Working on 6 years.
With 6 years. So he's kind of a newbie, to tell you the truth. Here, I've been working with MetaVest for quite some time. And MetaVest has been, if not the leader in the industry, one of the leaders in the industry here. One of the reasons why, and we're going to talk a little bit about our partnership with the Golden State Pool Trust here. One of the reasons when we were looking for a partner with the Golden State Pool Trust is that that MetaVest does education across the country here, and I was very impressed here by their founder here on a lot of the education that they would do here, and their knowledge about this ever-changing, although maybe not changing as much as it should, area of the law. So once again, they've been partners, and they administer our MSA trust here. And for those of you that are watching, you should have gotten a link to where the materials are. If not, if you're watching live on YouTube, you'll notice that there is a link in the subject section that actually has a link to the materials for today's program, which will include a copy of this presentation, a copy of the Golden State Pool Trust, MSA Trust, and a whole bunch of other materials here. I have actually found one thing nice about working with MetaVest is not only the work they do here as far as administering MSAs, the other part about it is that they are always there to answer questions in this very confusing area of law. MetaVest started in 1996 and they did their first MSA in 98, and that probably makes you folks the pioneers in all of this.
You can imagine what an MSA sounded like in 1998.
Yeah. So, you know, it is one of these areas that if you work with workers' comp attorneys or if you work with personal injury attorneys or whatever, this subject will come up over and over and over again. And having a partner like MetaVest who really understands things and can help work through this can really help you to work with your clients. You know, as I think I say this every time we have Joe on, Shelley and Annette and I here who work on most of the administration of the Golden State Pool Trust, whenever we get a request on can we pay this out of their MSA, we always send it off to the folks at MetaVest, and then we make a guess as to whether or not they're going to pay this expenditure or not. So far, we're at about 60%. We're actually doing better at guessing with this. And a lot of that illustrates that, you know, when you're dealing with what is a proper expenditure and what isn't a proper expenditure here, I don't think guessing is really a good standard involved in this. So anyway, I want to thank you, Joe, for joining us today. For those of you that are watching on YouTube Live, you'll notice there's a chat box there. If you have questions, and I really encourage you to come up with questions here, I'll be glad to pass that along. And when we get to the end of the program, I'll go through those questions. For those of you that are watching to get CLE credit, and this is through the State Bar of California here, in the link to the materials, there is a form to fill out, and it has 2 codes on it. So Joe is going to give us the codes at certain points in the presentation, and you need to mark down those codes and email that to Shelley, SHELLEY, at gspt.org, and we will send you 1 unit of MCLE credit for today's program. You can do that for the folks that are watching live today, and you can also, if you're going to be watching that later, that will be good for about a year. Anyway, Joe, I want to thank you so much here, and I know I learned something every time you do a presentation for us, so welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Steve, and welcome to everybody joining us today. Steve touched on a couple of very important points, one of which, bill paying capacity, right? Paying medical bills, and that's really what this boils down to, and that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. But before we get there, I would like to give everybody a little bit of a historical perspective and a little bit of context to just have a working knowledge about MSAs, where they've come from, why we do them, how do they fit with insurance settlements, how do they preserve Medicare benefits, and then all the way down to the operational execution for making distribution decisions post-settlement. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so we're going to start at the kind of 30,000 foot view level and work our way on down as we continue through this presentation. And where we start with is talking about funding for Medicare. And today, fortunately, we're not going to talk about what's happening in Washington or politics at all, but we do want a little bit of perspective before we venture too far down this hole. And as you can see on the screen, the Medicare Trust Fund has been heading towards insolvency frequently for decades, and it's no change now. But with what's happening with lots of talks about budget cuts, you can bet for sure that the government is very much interested and now invested in protecting those coffers in a couple of different ways. One, we talk about liens, past payments, conditional payments is what they're called, and wanting to make sure that they're getting repaid from insurance settlements. The other, which is what we're going to talk about today, is with regard towards future payments, right? And that's where this whole MSA comes into play, and it contemplates only future expenses. And they are very much interested now, more than ever, in protecting their interest as a secondary payer. And I'll explain more about what that means as a secondary payer. Okay, so a little bit of a timeline about Medicare secondary payer compliance. Start in 1965, Medicare was created, and a little known fact for our purposes today is originally when Medicare was created, the workers' compensation insurance was actually, from the onset, considered secondary to Medicare. However, absolutely nothing was done to enforce this. However, but it is part of the original legislation. 1980 comes along, and this is kind of the origin for this whole Medicare secondary payer compliance issue. MSP, this is directly where MSA stem from, Medicare set-asides. The MSP statute essentially says no double dipping. That's how I'd like you to view this conceptually. The MSP statute names 5 primary plans of insurance: liability, auto, no fault, work comp, and self-insured. Those 5 primary plans of insurance are just that, going to be viewed primary and thereby protect Medicare as a secondary payer. So the idea here, like I said, is no double dipping. I give you a hypothetical. John Doe or Jane Smith has an injury, work comp or liability. Some of that potential settlement contemplates future medical care for those injuries sustained. Medicare, conceptually with this MSP statute, would like to see some of that money from the insurance settlement be paid post-settlement for injury-related and tethered to that otherwise Medicare allowable expenses, right? Medicare pays for a lot, but they don't pay for everything. And going hand in hand with that, not every single medical expense for that injury victim is going to be related to the injury sustained, right? It could be unrelated or pre-existing. So with very specific regard for injury-related and otherwise Medicare allowable expenses, Medicare wants to make sure that someone else, some other source, is picking up the payment first, and the Medicare trust fund is second. And those other sources are those 5 primary plans of insurance, where both work comp and liability are explicitly named in the federal statute. And I want to call your attention to that, because if any of you out there have had any kind of experience working with MSAs or public benefit preservation in general within insurance settlements, you may have caught a lot of varying degrees of opinions and perhaps even misinformation at its worst about when do I need to think about protecting Medicare's interest. A lot of times there's been information over the years that this is simply a workers' compensation issue to solve for. That's because almost all of the commentary and information we have for Medicare is coming within the workers' compensation arena. However, there's a couple slides from now where I will show you and walk you through a timeline that talks about specific commentary for liability cases. And as I mentioned, please keep in mind, liability plan of insurance is explicitly named in the statute, and this is now more important than ever because Medicare is very interested in protecting their interest and taking the approach, a dollar saved is a dollar earned, right? So for every dollar that they don't have to pay out of the Medicare coffers and it can be paid for from somewhere else, that's just as well as if they were going to add additional funds into a budget, which we all know is more than likely not going to happen. So we have this MSP statute, and this is kind of the foundation for this whole issue that we're going to be dealing with, right? It names 5 primary plans of insurance, one of which is liability. No double dipping is the idea here. So we go on down the timeline. From 1980 to 2001, we have 21 years of inactivity. It's kind of the dark ages where they create this federal statute and then do nothing to enforce it. It's kind of the Scouts honor system. And as you can imagine, since nothing's done to enforce it, no one does anything about it. So Medicare's still paying for things when they otherwise shouldn't be. People are receiving insurance settlements that are contemplating medical care. They're on the Medicare program, or they're soon to be on the Medicare program. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a minute. But nonetheless, money's being spent from Medicare as a primary payer for medical expenses that they should otherwise be paying second. Problems. May 2001, the Government Accountability Office proposes a way to solve for this. Finally propose a solution. And what they come up with is something called a mandatory insured reporting. Now, I want to be very clear about this reporting requirement. If any one of you are joining us today that you may be a trial lawyer yourself, you may be a workers' compensation attorney, or you may be a trust and estate attorney perhaps that may be fielding phone calls or are asking to comment on protecting Medicare's interests in an insurance settlement. If you're advising an attorney to be mindful about something very important, I would ask you to remind them of this reporting requirement. What is this? We have this federal statute, right, that says no double dipping, something must be done. How does Medicare track, analyze, and enforce compliance with that statute? This is Medicare building out a means to build some teeth for compliance through this mandatory insurer reporting requirement. It is no responsibility placed on the plaintiff counsel to do anything. However, plaintiff counsel must be mindful that Medicare is getting their clients' claim information whether they like it or not. So Medicare, through this conduit of a mandatory insurer reporting, is receiving a pool of data to track, analyze, and enforce whether or not they are being protected as a secondary payer for a very specific scope, those injury-related and otherwise Medicare allowable expenses. So before we get into the liability timeline, let's do a little bit of a level set here. We have two pieces of law that are driving this whole space, we'll call it. One, the MSP federal statute, no double dipping, specifically names liability as a primary plan of insurance. And then we also have the Section 111 mandatory insurer reporting requirement, which is the means for Medicare to receive ongoing claim information about those individuals that are potentially receiving an insurance settlement, and they can track to make sure that medical codes or medical expenses, we'll just cut straight to it, are not being paid directly out of the Medicare trust fund when they should be paid for from some other source. So now, like I mentioned earlier, if any of you have any experience with Medicare set-asides or working in insurance settlements, there's a lot swirling around about how does this impact liability cases? Is this just a workers' compensation issue? And there has been, like Steve alluded to earlier, a lot of new information, but maybe not so much heavy on the action just yet. But I wanted to walk you through this liability MSA timeline here to give you just a little bit of context and hopefully read the tea leaves on what's happening as far as ways to track and enforce compliance. So starting from the very bottom, you have the federal statute. It specifically names liability as a primary plan of insurance. We move on to 2009, that reporting requirement, where now they're going to build a pipeline to gain medical claim information so they can track in compliance with that federal statute. We move to 2012, what's called the Announcement for Public Rulemaking. And this is a process that you go through where if you're going to change any rules, or if you're thinking about changing the way that you deal with something where it involves a government entity, this is kind of the standard process you go through. The government says, hey, we're going to think about changing some rules. This is what we're thinking about doing. The second, you can see below that, in October of 2012, they say there's a comment period where anyone that would be involved in the space or industry can submit commentary for things they should be aware of or suggested solutions. In 2014, October of 2014, there were proposed rules, and those rules were pulled from the table. Now, again, just as anything else, there is a wide range of opinion that I'm sure if you searched around the internet for 10 or 15 minutes, you could find all kinds of blogs and people's opinions and information and, guesses essentially on what happened. All we know definitively are that those rules were pulled. Some people say it was as trivial as too much time went by and they needed to go back to the drawing board to figure out how to deal with Medicare secondary payer compliance for liability cases. Some people on the other end of the scope said no, they did economic impact studies and said if we were to enforce these rules, it would be catastrophic, the ripple effect on these potential liability insurance settlements going through. One piece of information to consider on why these rules were pulled. As you may be aware, or as I mentioned earlier, most of the commentary that we have to work with, the framework for dealing with Medicare secondary payer compliance, is written and comes from the workers' compensation arena. If you think about workers' compensation claims and liability settlements, they're vastly different, right? It's apples and oranges. So if Medicare tried to just kind of copy over the framework for dealing with Medicare set-asides, but more so protecting Medicare's interests, take those work comp rules and apply them in the liability space, it won't work. It doesn't work. Some things to think about. In liability cases, we have to deal with policy issues, comparative negligence, all sorts of issues that don't necessarily happen on work comp claims that will impact a settlement and will impact the medical that are received in that settlement. So we know that we have to write different rules and guidelines for protecting Medicare's interests in the liability space that we can't just take from work comp claims. So take that as you like. Today, we live in a world where there still is a federal statute where we have to protect Medicare's interests for liability cases. How we do that, how we get there, is completely a risk tolerance decision that all the stakeholders in the settlement can come to. I want to be very, very clear and stress the fact that Medicare set-asides are not mandatory. There's never a situation where you're compelled to do an MSA. The reason being is because the Medicare set-aside is just a compliance tool. It's a means to an end, right? It's a way to achieve compliance and protect Medicare's interest as secondary payer per that federal statute. Medicare set-asides aren't even mandatory in workers' compensation claims. However, we see that they are the preferred compliance tool. So if any of you work with workers' comp claims and an individual is a Medicare beneficiary or likely to become a beneficiary within 30 months of the settlement, you'll see that there's almost always an MSA done if they're going to close out the future medical. How does that change in the liability arena? Decisions are usually driven by plaintiff counsel and not the carrier, and that's a good thing because it's a decision between the attorney and their client on what they choose to do to protect their Medicare benefits. And we'll talk a little bit about the rest of this presentation on some strategies to be mindful of when you're thinking about protecting Medicare's interest, but also balancing that within allowing and creating the space for a settlement to take place and not hoarding funds into a set-aside account and disrupting a potential settlement. So we go all the way to the very end of this liability timeline to last year, this change request notice, 9893 change request notice. Again, if you search the internet, there'll be all kinds of commentary that says this was a formal memo, an announcement from Medicare about liability set-asides. Not true. This is technically a change request from Medicare to their contractors, putting them on notice that they would like to see changes with some of that reporting information that we talked about from the Section 111 reporting, new points of data that they want to have captured to better enforce compliance and track compliance with protecting their interest. But what did this do? This change request to their contractors sent a ripple through our entire industry saying, liability MSAs are here. Now, what are we going to do? How do we protect ourselves and our clients? What best practices do we put forth? And it's not quite that doomsday-ish. Nothing has really quite changed yet. In fact, to end the year, they actually amended that change request notice to pull their implementation date. Originally, they said October 4th of 2017. They wanted to have this new implementation date for the new data. That was pushed back. They pulled that. So again, you can make assumption as to why they pulled that. Different levels of what kind of impact they may or may not have. But the fact of the matter is, today at least, if you're working through an insurance settlement and you have an individual that is a Medicare beneficiary or soon to be, then Medicare's interest must be protected in some way, shape, or form, but that's not always through the MSA vehicle. So, a little bit of that level setting, give a little bit of a historical perspective. Hopefully I've driven home the point about MSAs are not mandatory, but what is mandatory is protecting the Medicare Trust Fund as a secondary payer when it's appropriate. So if you're working with attorneys on insurance settlements, you can boil this down to a 3-step process. The first one would be verifying public benefits, if any. Who are the players involved, right? What public benefit programs are at stake? And each program will probably take different steps to protect those benefits. We need to uncover them. The second step would be, for this purposes of today's presentation, where we'll talk about protecting Medicare benefits and different considerations on creating an MSA report. Then the third and final step, kind of what Steve was mentioning earlier when he gave his introduction, proper administration, right? Post-settlement distribution making decisions. These are all medical bills. These are all medical needs. It's less of a legal problem to solve and more of a medical problem to solve. What I mean by that is protecting Medicare's interest is binary. It's yay or nay, right? If Medicare has an interest to be protected in your settlement, that can be uncovered. And if the answer is yes, then we can form a game plan on how we do that, which is solving medical needs and problems. If the answer is no, we don't have to protect Medicare's interest in this case, then it's a matter of documentation and supporting the evidence to that conclusion and moving forward with the potential settlement. And there is no medical consideration to go through. So protecting Medicare's interest is a medical problem to solve when there is a need in the case. Very important stopping point real quick. Like Steve mentioned, this is the first code for continuing legal education. It's 7975. Make sure that you include that on your form that you received and send that off to Shelly. So if you want to make sure and get your credits for participating in this presentation today. So we'll go ahead and give you a second to grab that code, and we'll keep moving on here. All right, so step one, this whole process, the first thing we need to do is uncover what public benefits are at stake. Now keep in mind, everything that we're working through today, everything that we're talking about is all within the context of an insurance settlement. So if you don't work with insurance settlements, if you don't really work with trusts that are set up, or funded I should say, through an insurance settlement, you probably won't encounter this situation hardly ever. But if this is an area that you're experiencing an increase in inbound phone calls from colleagues in your area asking for guidance on how to protect Medicare's interest, or for asking for help on crafting Medicare set-asides, or ways to advise on a potential settlement through Medicare benefit preservation, then this is a perfect presentation for you to join. The very first step is trying to figure out if you even have an interest, if Medicare even has an interest in your case. There's a number of ways that you can go through this and help your clients. There's a Social Security verification check that you can do, and there's 2 ways to achieve this. One way is long. I'm not gonna lie. There's plenty of vendors out there that were more than willing to do this service for you, where they basically have some releases signed, put on file, and they go to the individual's local Social Security office, and they get a form that says if they've applied for Social Security disability, if they have an open, pending, or appealed claim, if not, if they have Medicare benefits or some other benefit program. Now, you're at the mercy of the Social Security office, so it takes a while. But I want to call attention to the difference between SSDI and SSI. And why do we care about Social Security disability with regard to Medicare? The way that the program is set up is if an individual has access to Social Security disability benefits, after 24 months they'll be rolled onto Medicare. They'll have access to the Medicare program. So Medicare takes a very conservative approach in saying anyone that has access to Social Security disability benefits, those individuals will be soon coming onto the Medicare program. Therefore, they want to see something done at settlement time to protect their interests as a secondary payer. That's part of where we get that 24, 30-month window that I mentioned before, right? If an individual is a Medicare beneficiary, or if an individual is assumed to be Medicare beneficiary, we must do something to protect Medicare's interest as a secondary payer with specific regard to injury-related and otherwise Medicare allowable expenses at the time of settlement. So, going back to SSDI, what we want to make sure and uncover is if the claimant has been denied Medicare SSDI benefits, or if they have an open or pending appeals process for that application. The reason being, we don't want to just know if they've applied or not. If you've ever had experience working with an individual going through this process, you know it's a rather long and sometimes arduous process to gain access to these disability benefits. And more times than not, you just get denied the first time through. So it's very much not uncommon to get denied, go through an appeals process, and have a very long window from date of application to date of actual acceptance for those or gaining access to those benefits. The reason why we want to know and capture that timeline is for game planning purposes with a potential settlement. I'll give you an example. An individual is injured, individual has a potential settlement, that settlement's contemplating medical care. We uncover that they've applied for Social Security disability benefits 7 months ago, but the application wasn't closed out. It was denied and it was appealed. And these appeals process can go through a couple different evolutions while it's all being called an appeal. Once that individual goes through an appeal and they finally gain access to benefits 7 months later, those benefits become active retroactively from the date of the first application. That means if you've settled out your case, or you know that you're going to be settling out a case, and the application date for original submission for those benefits is prior to the settlement date, and then they're finally awarded benefits down the road post-settlement, then it crosses over that time period of, does Medicare have an interest to be protected at the time of settlement, that snapshot in time. So when we're trying to form a game plan to appropriately advise our attorney clients, we need to know where they're at in that process for Social Security disability benefits. Now, I mentioned there's two options to kind of do this first step. The first one is a Social Security check, right? And it's a long process through the local Social Security office, and there's tons of vendors that can do that for you. The second, and I would advise everybody to jot this down, you can have the claimant, with a little bit of help from an individual, the attorney, or an assistant or something, kind of help themselves, create an account on SSA.gov, create their own account. Once they create an account, they can click on something called Request Benefit Verification Letter. Once they get that letter, almost immediately it'll tell them any and all public benefits that they have access to. That's a great letter and piece of information for all of us to start doing some actual settlement planning around protecting their benefits, whether they be asset-based benefits or whether they be entitlement-based benefits. We need to uncover those public benefit programs so then we can then form the proper game plan to solve for and then do some financial planning to work within the kind of medical care that they'll need. So step one, what public benefits are at stake, right? And those are two options to go uncover those benefit programs. I also want to give you a couple common triggers for thinking about protecting Medicare's interests as a secondary payer. It's kind of like a cheat sheet, if you will. Is the individual at least 62 and a half years old? Do they have an application open, pending, or accepted for SSDI benefits? Those are the biggest two triggers where you'll need to think about protecting Medicare's interest. From there, there's a couple of rare situations which everyone should be aware of if they do present themselves, like end-stage renal disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, that maybe survivor benefits through a parent. Those things can get a little tricky and convoluted. So when in doubt, if you're not certain, start with step one, find out for certain what public benefits there are, and move forward. But just as a general help with working through your case flow, is they 62 and a half years old, or do they have SSDI benefits? If the answer is yes to either one of those triggers, you know that you need to think about some iteration of a Medicare set-aside to protect Medicare's interest. So we've gone from step one. Let's say for purposes of today, the individual has Medicare benefits. Okay, so now we know that we need to protect Medicare's interest with those future Medicare allowable expenses that are directly related to those injuries sustained. So now again, like I mentioned earlier, we pivot immediately to a medical problem to solve and plan for, right? These Medicare set-aside accounts are 100% medical dollars. We need to match injuries, medical codes, and expenses, dollars, to all of those injuries and project them out so we know what we're looking at as far as meeting medical care and making sure that the Medicare Trust Fund isn't paying dime one when some other source should be, a la the Medicare set-aside. So going back to things that, there's a little bit of misinformation, or, you've heard things or read things on blogs. What's required and what's voluntary, right? A lot of times people are misinformed that MSAs are required under certain conditions. Never the case. Remember, even in work comp claims, MSAs are never forced. You're never compelled to do an MSA. What you are in certain situations compelled to do is protect Medicare's interest as a secondary payer. What is required? Demonstrate a reasonable and adequate consideration of Medicare's interest in a settlement. There's a number of ways that we can do that. It doesn't have to be always a Medicare set-aside. And please keep in mind, MSAs are not widgets. There's a number of ways that we can work through these MSAs and build them out that fit within the unique circumstances of each individual case, given what's happening and the information that's presented to us. The other thing that's required is protect Medicare's interest as for injury-related expenses that are otherwise Medicare allowable. Remember, the MSA is not a general medical slush fund or a catch-all medical account. There's kind of a two-pronged test that goes to these accounts. Is it directly related to the injury sustained? And tethered to that, is it something that would Medicare otherwise pay for? They pay for a lot, but they don't pay for everything. Perhaps some of the folks that are joining us today have experience working with Special Needs Trust, protecting asset-based benefits like SSI or Medi-Cal if we're here in California, or your state Medicaid program if you're elsewhere. A lot of times I'll get a question, because it's a big ticket item, what about skilled nursing care? That's a big expense, right? Medicare does not typically pay for skilled nursing care, so it's normally not something that would ever be contemplated in the MSA. So just a little bit of an example on these MSA accounts don't cover everything globally as far as medical needs or care. Going over to the other side of your screen, what's voluntary? Submitting MSAs for CMS review, and CMS is basically an interchangeable term for Medicare. Submitting MSAs for review is 100% voluntary. Again, there's never a situation, work comp or liability, where you're compelled to submit an MSA for CMS review and approval. In fact, we strongly advise that you refrain from doing this. And a couple reasons why. Number one, you're not compelled to do so. Number two, if you were to submit an MSA, a liability MSA, for review, chances are you may not hear back from the contractor. You might go into a black hole, not uncommon. Or at best, you may get a letter back from Medicare saying at this time, due to workload constraints, we're not reviewing liability MSAs. However, this does not serve as a safe harbor, and we've all basically spent a lot of time waiting to get nothing in return. Or the last reason why we strongly suggest you refrain from submitting these MSAs for approval, especially for liability cases, is on the off chance that a contractor picks up liability MSA, on the off chance that a contractor picks up a liability MSA for review, they can, and they review it. What will likely come back is something they call a counter hire. And a counter hire is just a fancy way of saying you submitted an MSA to us, and let's say hypothetically at $50,000. That works. We have a settlement in place. Everything is in order. We just want to go that extra mile and get approval from CMS to say $50,000 works. We've submitted it. Off chance they picked it up, they reviewed it. Now they come back with a counter hire saying, actually, we think $150,000 should be adequate to set aside in this case. That's a big problem. That's thrown a major wrench into a settlement where we've almost gotten it done and completed, and now we have a formal notice from the Medicare contractor saying a number that is significantly higher than what we all thought it should be. That's a big problem to untangle. All of that can be avoided through proper game planning. If we have to build out a set aside or protect Medicare's interest, work with somebody that can offer the stakeholders in the settlement a risk transfer. It's possible to do. Again, think about this as a medical problem to solve, not so much a legal one. Once we know that we have to protect Medicare's interest, it's about doing the diligence on what future medical expenses should not be paid for by the Medicare coffers, or at least first as primary. So when we're going through that process, you can work with folks out there that can build out these allocation reports or arrive at a suggested amount to set aside and then shepherd those dollars where they should go. This is something that I really want to drive home today, and we'll get to this in step 3. But it's important to bring up here. If you take away nothing from this presentation today, please take away this one thing. MSP compliance is less about what's the magic number and almost has everything to do with proper post-settlement distribution making decisions. How do you pay bills? What do you spend money on? So I don't mean to be cavalier or give you the idea that you can just pluck a number out of thin air and say it works, because that's not what I'm saying. But as long as you do something reasonable and adequate to protect Medicare's interests, and you can show what you've done and it's defensible, which again, working with a expert can offer you that transfer of risk, because they will bind themselves to those decisions and they will be the ones to stand in the way of CMS if there's ever an audit. You should make sure that you're working with someone that can offer that to you. That's very important. But once you've arrived on what an adequate number looks like, Medicare spends its time, energy, and dollars now from a budgetary standpoint wanting to track compliance with how did that money get spent. If you had a $50,000 set aside and you put a down payment on a car, that's egregious. We know that there's problems. But if you have $50,000 set aside and you're just paying general medical bills because you think that's what it's for, that's also a problem. We'll get into that with the third step, but that's a very, very important piece, that when you're talking with your colleagues or working with an attorney on this issue to arrive at a settlement, it's very important to remain mindful that compliance is all about adequate and appropriate distribution making decisions, and not so much getting hung up on what's the magic number, is it enough, what will Medicare think. So some things to consider or just have in the back of your mind as general working knowledge if you ever come across MSAs, or if someone's asking you to maybe review a report that was done, think about, these are going to be some important things to keep in mind about Medicare set-aside. So first and foremost, Medicare set-aside report is really just a report that projects an individual's future Medicare allowable and injury-related medical and prescription expenses. You can think about these reports as basically two silos, right? They're medical expenses and drug expenses. And together, it arrives at a dollar figure that says this number is adequate to set aside for protecting Medicare's interest. The timeline that you're making allocation decisions is off of the individual's life expectancy. One consideration to keep in mind: we never want to make allocation decisions off a normal life table. If someone is chronologically 65 years old, we don't want to just make allocation decisions off a normal, healthy 65-year-old timetable. We want to get what's called a rated age. And a rated age gives us basically a new life expectancy that encompasses and takes into account a 65-year-old that sustained whatever injury that they did. Maybe, it was a med mal case. Medical malpractice was committed. Well, okay, they were 65 years old and there was a medical malpractice that was committed. They have heart disease in their family. They were a smoker maybe. They had a bad accident when they were a young adult. It takes into account everything and renders back a rated age that says maybe they're chronologically 65 years old, but for all things considered, they're maybe more so like a 75-year-old. So we've just shaved off 10 years of having to make allocation decisions within this report, which in virtue of that opens up and redistributes settlement dollars out of the MSA and not hoards them into the MSA account. So we want to get them a rated age, life expectancy, while we're making these reports. Now the bottom half of this slide, these MSA reports are normally priced according to the applicable state fee schedules, such as workers' comp, or usual and customary, or average wholesale pricing. For liability cases, Medicare suggests that you use usual and customary rates. This is very high. It's almost like retail. Now again, keep in mind, we're making allocation decisions, right, off of purely medical needs. If you can work with someone and partner with someone that can not only offer you up that risk transfer that I mentioned earlier about doing the diligence for projecting future medical needs, but they can also compress the cost of care and not use fee schedules that are so high, and use a better and more aggressive fee schedules to still deliver the same quality of care, but just at a lower rate, you've again found another way to compress these set-aside accounts and again redistribute settlement dollars back elsewhere into the settlement. So again, when we're thinking about these MSAs, all we are doing is addressing future medicals, right? We want to think about the timeline, like I said, the rated age, life expectancy. We want to think about the frequencies, surgeries, prescriptions, fills on those prescriptions, DME, ongoing visits, PT visits. We're having to allocate, is it 5 visits a year for 20 years? Is it 3 visits a year? Is it 10 a month? What is it? Think about appropriate frequencies that someone may need. And again, all of these are just variables, right, that are always going to be in flux and changing given what's happened in this case. Medical needs are always different. People's injuries are always different. They're going to get healthy. They're going to get sick. So it's a moving target, but we want to be able to match their medical needs as accurately as possible in these allocation reports while still straddling that line of not compromising a potential settlement, which goes right into the next bullet, maximizing settlement dollars. When we're addressing future medicals, we always want to be mindful of maximizing the settlement dollars that are at stake. Compressing the cost of care, again, you can work with someone that can realize medical needs, goods, and services at a lower rate than what a layperson could on their own. By all means, that needs to be done. Apportionment. Apportionment is perhaps the best tool that we have for liability cases to protect Medicare's interest adequately, but also allow for the best settlement possible. I'll give you a quick idea about apportionment. If a case settles for, maybe the case gets full value, or excuse me, maybe the case gets policy limits. There's $1 million policy and it's settled for the policy, but perhaps maybe that case was worth 5 times that, but policy limits were tendered. Maybe there was comparative fault, right? It's not just a black and white situation. We want to take that into consideration when we're thinking about the final set-aside number. If a case settles for less than full value, and there's things like liens that need to be paid back, there's comparative negligence, there's all sorts of factors that we want to take into account, you're going to use that initial MSA report, that allocation, as kind of like your foundational analysis, but you're going to view it as fully valued at 100%. And if a case settles for 10% of its full value, then we can take a 10% apportioned share of that fully valued set aside and call that our new MSA. Again, consult with an expert on the proper mechanics on how to apportion an MSA appropriately, but please know that should always be done when possible to still adequately give Medicare its fair share, protecting their interest, but not overly hoarding settlement dollars where they could better serve an individual elsewhere, like perhaps flowing into a trust to meet their quality of care as opposed to being pigeonholed into an MSA. We always want to find ways to get money out of the set aside without rubbing up against any gray lines in order to adequately address and match the kind of care the individual is going to need and support a better quality of life. Ensuring post-settlement medical care. Again, I can't beat this, I can't drive this point home enough throughout today's presentation. MSP compliance is not about the magic number. MSP compliance is about proper and adequate distribution-making decisions post-settlement. Professional administration is the cornerstone of Medicare secondary payer compliance. It's also a risk transfer, like I've mentioned earlier, and that's what we're going to talk about in step 3. This should be a handout that everybody should have access to. I don't expect anybody to be able to read through this on the screen, but it's a quick little reference guide that you can stick in a drawer to kind of give you a little bit of an idea on two important parts about MSAs. The first half is, when is an MSA recommended? And it's a quick little decision matrix, right? And it goes back to, are they 62 and a half years old? Do they have Medicare benefits, or do they have access to SSDI, or where they are in that appeals process? And the latter half is about the actual creation process of what goes into creating a Medicare set-aside, kind of peeling back the curtains a little bit on the allocation process. So again, successful MSP compliance is an adequate set-aside, but more so proper administration. Kind of a little level set from things that we've talked about, some important points here. CMS submission is always optional. For liability MSAs, don't do it. It's not in your best interest. Like I said, either they won't look at it, it'll go into a black hole, or you'll get a meaningless letter that offers no kind of safe harbor, or when you're any kind of goodwill you were trying to make, it won't do that. It will just waste time. But on the off chance they do review it, it could come back with a counter hire, and that only opens up a can of worms and more problems to solve than doing any kind of benefit. If you're worried about protecting not only the individual but the stakeholders in the settlement, and you think that CMS submission is the answer, it's not. The answer instead is working with the right experts that can offer you that guarantee in the work product. So if there's ever a post-settlement audit or inquiry, they are the ones to defend that audit and dispute it, and ultimately make good on the audit if they can't get Medicare to change their mind. CMS thresholds for submission: 100% voluntary. Often we'll get questions, or people will be slightly mixing a couple of things together when they say, oh, I only need to do an MSA if they're on Medicare and the settlement's over $25,000, then I have to do an MSA. I'm compelled to do one. That's mixing up submission thresholds and whether or not I do an MSA. If the individual is on Medicare and you want to submit the MSA, you're only allowed to participate in the CMS submission process if the global settlement's $25,000 or more. The next one, if you have an individual that's 30 months from being on Medicare, most likely they have Social Security disability, right? They don't yet have Medicare benefits. You can't even participate in the CMS submission process unless the global settlement is $250,000 or more. That does not mean if I have an individual that's 30 months from being on Medicare, I don't have to do an MSA, or I don't have to protect Medicare's interest unless the global settlement is $250,000 or more. That is not what that means. These are purely just review thresholds that must be met if you want to participate in the CMS approval process. So please keep in mind that these review thresholds have nothing to do about, do I need to protect Medicare's interest, and everything to do about, could I submit this MSA if I wanted to. Keep in mind, CMS submission is probably not the answer. You're best doing something different, like we've talked about before, where you can work with someone to offer those risk transfers. And do I have to do an MSA? What people mean to say more often than not is not, do I have to do an MSA? Because technically the answer is no, right? It's just a means to an end. What they typically mean to say is, do I have to protect Medicare's interest in my case? And that's a binary decision. It's yay or nay. It's, are they 30 months out from being on Medicare, or do they have Medicare benefits? And then it immediately pivots to medical problems to solve. So step 3, we've started with what are the public benefits at stake? How do we uncover those so we can form an adequate game plan? We've gone to step 2 for protecting Medicare's interest as a secondary payer. You have an individual that has access to Medicare. We can go through building out a Medicare set-aside. Keep in mind, through that process, if they're not widgets, they can be developed and implemented in a number of different ways. Think about compressing the cost of care where you can, rated age life expectancies, using preferred fee schedules, getting access to discount plans and PBM networks for maybe drug expenses. that you can allocate lesser amount but still meet the same quality of care, and then having those accounts professionally administered. Now, professional administration, like I said, is probably the most overlooked aspect of MSP compliance, but it's certainly the most crucial. Oftentimes, if you don't work with these accounts frequently, the thought process is, well, MSP compliance means I have to carve out a certain amount from my settlement and then I'm good. And that's not quite it. You're not quite to the finish line. You could do all of the diligence in the world and do the best medical underwriting there ever was and arrive at a very solid figure to carve out in your settlement. But if you turn that over to somebody, whether it's the injured person themselves or someone that's going to help them, a family member or whatever, or maybe even a banker in some situations that doesn't really understand how to deal with Medicare set-asides, they spend the money where they shouldn't be spending it. All that work is for nothing. It goes out the window. There is no sliding scale of forgiveness when you're talking about compliance in the eyes of Medicare. That money needs to be spent on appropriate, reasonable, and adequate expense that are directly related to the injury sustained and otherwise Medicare allowable. And oftentimes that sounds fairly simple and easy, or straightforward even. But I'll give you a quick example or something to think about. If any of you at home can just open up a separate window right now and Google search the cost of a total knee replacement in the 94925 area code, you'll probably get all kinds of answers. But what does the proper fee schedule for that entail? What's the proper ICD codes? Could you bundle those codes? What is the difference? Imagine trying to place that burden on a lay person, whether they're the injured person or the family or a banker or somewhere in between, and saying, I don't only need to deal with, can this come from the set-aside or can't it? Was it related to the injury? Was it exacerbated? Did it cause another injury? Is that connected now? Okay, maybe we pass that first test and we feel like, okay, the injury itself or this expense can come from the MSA. We're not done yet. What's the proper fee schedule? What's the appropriate amount that I could pay for that expense out of the set aside? That's a really tough one to find out if you're just an average consumer, a normal layperson. How much was allocated in the report? What happened if somebody used preferred rates to allocate that total knee replacement, thinking that an expert or a certain vendor could procure that amount if and when the time came? So they allocated, let's just say for round numbers, let's say $12,000. But if a different person's handling that account and it comes time to pay for that replacement and they get billed at $20,000 and they just pay it, that's a problem. You're spending through the MSA account at a faster pace than you otherwise should be. So you can see conceptually the idea of administering your own MSA might sound like it's fairly straightforward. I'm just paying my medical bills. But it's not. And that's where the whole idea of proper compliance, protecting Medicare's interests, this is where this comes into play. And as I mentioned before, when we think about where Medicare is spending their time, energy, and dollars on enforcing compliance, the best example that I can give you to illustrate this point is, as I talked to you today, doing this video presentation, there's never been one single case out there where there was a $50,000 set aside done and Medicare audited the file and said, $50,000, we think it should have been $75,000. And now we have problems. That has yet to happen. Conversely, what Medicare is doing, and within the last couple years has accelerated the rate at which they're doing, is you take the same exact example of $50,000 set aside, Medicare says, I'm not going to fight you on trying to become a quasi-medical expert and try to refute what you've done to arrive at a $50,000 set aside, so long as it's reasonable, it's not egregious, right? You've done something defensible and reasonable. I'm not going to fight you. $50,000, fine. But I want to know, where's the $50,000 going? How did it get spent? How is it being spent? And that's where they spend their energy. That whole problem, potential problem, is solved for through professional administration. So what does Medicare say? What are the actual requirements? And then what can you do to properly administer the account? But these are the things that you have to do regardless if you're the injured person, Aunt Sally, a banker, or a professional. There's no sliding scale here. Funds must be placed in an interest-bearing account. Could be as simple as going down to your local credit union and opening up a checking account if you wanted to, but understand the risk that goes along with that decision. MSA funds must be administered by a competent administrator. There's a memo from 2004 that basically says unless you're ruled incompetent by the courts, technically you can administer your own MSA. However, why the heck would you want to? I know at our company, we've worked with claims managers, retired workers' compensation judges, you name it. It doesn't matter what your background is or how skilled or educated you think you may or may not be. It does not matter. These accounts are things that you should probably not take on yourself. A person may self-administer his or her own MSA, but all the rules and regulations are the same. Like I said, there's no sliding scale of forgiveness. Doesn't matter if you're an expert, doesn't matter if you're a trustee, doesn't matter if you're someone's uncle or aunt. The rules are what they are. And going back to that example, if you use the wrong fee schedule, if you pay for the wrong item, for the wrong body part, you're inviting so many problems that could otherwise be solved for very easily through professional administration. Professional administrator must forward an annual accounting statements to CMS for review. This is basically their way of keeping track every year. It's you're submitting any account activity, money coming in, money coming out, to Medicare every single year on what's happening with the MSA account. So imagine if you're self-administering your own account and you're halfway through the year, you know what? You really need to make that tuition payment, or you need to make the mortgage payment, or you wanted a cosmetic surgery, anything in between. The money's there, and perhaps you borrow against it with every good intention of putting money back. Or maybe you were just making a really good faith effort and you thought you were spending the money appropriately. Every single year you have to offer up an accounting to Medicare for them to do a review and audit. And if things don't match, those are problems. Worst case scenario, they turn off Medicare. Best case scenario, which really isn't best case, is it becomes treated like a super lien. They say, you know what, we think that you actually owe the account, us, 10, 12,000, 15, whatever it may be, and you need to put money back into that account. That's a big problem for just about anybody out there. More requirements. Annual self-attestation letters required for self-administered MSAs. Like I said, doesn't matter if you're professional or not. That's just a fancy way of saying you have to offer up an accounting to Medicare every single year. Administration fees and attorney fees cannot be charged to the MSA account. This is a common question that we get. If you have a Medicare set-aside account, you'd like somebody to administer it, there's likely going to be a fee, sometimes a nominal fee even. Can you just pull that amount from the Medicare set-aside to pay for the fee of administration? We should be able to do this. Unfortunately, the world we live in today, right now, we can't. I know our trade associations and our special, lobbying groups, where this is definitely the top of the agenda to try to change. It makes all the sense in the world to basically lean on professionals out there as your compliance partner. From the eyes of Medicare, if you would have professional administration of more of these accounts, the longer they'll exist, the more that you'll keep people from the Medicare coffers prematurely. It goes right in line with what we're all here trying to do. Unfortunately, Medicare takes a very short-sighted view in that every single dime in that account should be used for medical expenses and nothing else, except for a couple small things, which it's frustrating if nothing else, like account maintenance fees, photocopying, postage, bank fees. Those items can come from the MSA, so they throw us a small break there. But for what really matters, like converting these to having them administered by a professional and the small fee to do that today they still don't allow for that. The additional income tax earned on the MSA can be charged to the account. If you have a professional administrator, they'll help you and walk you through this. If you're self-administering, again, all the onus in its entirety is placed on your shoulders. Important stopping point, another continuing legal education code. This is the second one. 5297 is the code, so make sure you jot that down, get that on your form, and send it over to Shelley for continuing legal education credits. And the last slide, I believe, or the second to last slide on CMS requirements. Upon death of the claimant, the funds may be dispersed pursuant to state law. However, this involves holding the account, I should say, for 15 and 27 months for bills to be paid. Now, that's not a hard line in the sand to be drawn. If you need the accounts to be relinquished faster, they certainly can. The idea behind this is if somebody passes away, there could be trickling bills coming in, and it's a heck of a lot easier to satisfy those bills, get them paid while you still have money in the account before you release them. Keep in mind when you're thinking about these accounts, and in the event of a death and there's money still in the account, keep in mind for something called reversionary interest agreements. These can be added into settlement documents where perhaps a carrier will share in the cost of administration or fund it, maybe even in its totality, on a condition of a reversionary agreement, where basically it's a clawback clause to say the money in this account is medical money. If the individual is not here to satisfy those medical needs, then the money should revert back to the carrier as a windfall. Not here to give an opinion either way, but just something to be very mindful of, because normally this should be 100 cents of the dollar should be the claimant's money, and for them to direct where they want it to go and not revert back to a carrier. So be mindful of reversionary interest agreements that may pop up from time to time when you're thinking about MSAs at settlement time. Temporary exhaustion versus permanent exhaustion. Thinking about funding these accounts. A lot of times it makes sense to fund these accounts with an annuity or structured settlement, which is funded through an annuity, as opposed to cash. The reason why it makes sense is because let's say you have a $100,000 MSA obligation. Instead of taking $100,000 off the top of your settlement and calling it your set aside, maybe you could fund that $100,000 obligation with an annuity for $75,000 today, but it pays out the $100,000 over the life to meet $100,000. Now you've just freed up a fair amount of money, again, to recycle and redistribute elsewhere into the settlement while still protecting Medicare's interest adequately. People ask, what does Medicare think about funding these accounts with an annuity versus lump sum? And actually, on the guidebook, I believe page 8 or 12, I can't quite recall, but they use the example of actually funding an MSA in their guidebook using an annuity. So they're champions of using the annuity. However, their motives are different than ours. Medicare takes the stance that if you fund it with an annuity and somebody blows through their first annuity payment, they might have 15, 20, or 25 tries to get it right, depending on how many installments are coming in. So it's kind of like putting stop signs than just turning over a lump sum of cash to an individual. And Medicare is also assuming that, or they had assumed historically, that these accounts would be self-administered. However, just last year, when they made their amendments to the guidebook, they now include a section to say that professional administration is strongly encouraged for these Medicare set-aside accounts, which might seem like a small or trivial thing, but that's Medicare making leaps and bounds in the way of proper compliance, because little by little, chipping away for them to understand that real compliance is not being so hung up on the set-aside amount with review thresholds or having a contractor look it over and approve it and review it, or say you need more money in it, or including more medical records to review just to get an adequate number, where really compliance is all about how is this person living with this money and spending it post-settlement. That's their best interest. So haven't yet come to the promised land to allow professional administration fees to come out of the set-aside, but they are becoming more of a champion to say, yes, it's very important to have the right type of person with the right kind of skill sets to administer these accounts, so they are used appropriately and not putting people back on the Medicare program prematurely. So temporary exhaustion and permanent exhaustion is, let's say you have the accounts funded with an annuity. Case settles, there's immediate amount of cash put into the MSA to cover year one of expenses. Beginning year two, an annuity payment of $10,000 comes into the account on an annual basis for the rest of their life expectancy. Again, medical needs are volatile, right? Sometimes you're healthy, sometimes you're sick, things happen. Life goes up and down. So maybe you blow through that $10,000 annuity payment with 4 months to go until the next one comes in. What do? The account's at zero, but you have medical needs to take care of. This is called temporary exhaustion, and how Medicare handles this situation is whomever the administrator is, and again, great idea to have a professional administrator. The administrator puts Medicare on notice. Medicare does a quick audit to say, how did you spend through the $10,000? Once they've kind of give it their blessing to say the money has been spent appropriately, Medicare will surface as the primary payer on an interim basis while there's no money in the account, while the account's insolvent. It's important to note that this is not on a lien basis. This is Medicare picking up the tab on those bills in the interim, where once that next annuity payment comes back into the account, it's solvent once again, you have $10,000 to work with, the administrator puts Medicare back on notice, they sink back down to number 2, and the MSA account again becomes primary to make payments from. Permanent exhaustion is when the account completely goes down to zero. There's no more money coming in, it's all been spent. The administrator must put Medicare on notice. They do their final look back of how all the money has been spent. They want to know where every dime went. As long as everything is approved and acceptable, then you'll transition the individual back to Medicare, where they can just go back to treating with their Medicare card, and it doesn't matter having to decipher between, does this come from the MSA, does this come from Medicare, do they share in this cost, is there another line of insurance? All that coordination problem now, once the MSA has been spent appropriately, they can just use their health insurance or a combination of Medicare or just Medicare purely, depending on what the situation is. Misuse of the MSA funds jeopardize the claimant's Medicare eligibility until the funds have been reimbursed. That's the whole reason why we're doing this, right? You go all the way back to the very beginning of this, right? If you're working in insurance settlements, or if you're advising people going through public benefit preservation, coming into an insurance settlement, the whole reason why you go through this whole process of protecting Medicare's interest, how do you do it? How do you make sure it doesn't blow up your settlement? What will Medicare, think and act with the decisions you make? All of these things you go through is all in the name of protecting the person's eligibility for Medicare. So again, the best thing that you can do is have that account administered by somebody that can offer you up all the stakeholders in the settlement, a risk transfer and guarantee, and take on the responsibility of proper administration and see that account through all the way to zero and transfer that person back to Medicare. Paying the medical bills. That's what this is all about. We're almost wrapping up here. We're getting close to the end, so I kind of want to just go through a quick review of hopefully the major takeaways. The first being the two major pieces of insurance, the two major pieces of law that drive this whole space. The 1980 MSP statute, right, that says no double dipping. It names 5 primary plans of insurance. One of them is liability. You also have the Section 111 reporting. It is no responsibility placed on the plaintiff counsel. However, they need to be mindful that the payer is obligated to submit ongoing claim information onto Medicare so they can track, analyze, and enforce compliance with the statute, protecting Medicare's interest. How you protect Medicare's interest is completely a decision between you and your client. You are never obligated or compelled to do an MSA. MSAs aren't even mandatory for work comp claims. MSAs are just a means to an end. When you're problem solving for these, it's 100% a medical problem to solve. And this is a quick little synopsis, this slide right here, on the kind of a medical problem that it is to solve. Is it directly related to the injury or indirect? Imagine trying to work through a med-mal case. Oftentimes, we're trying to always toggle back and forth between, was this caused? Was this exacerbated? Somewhere in between? Did it lead to other issues? All kinds of variables where it's not black and white. Contrast that with workers' comp claims, right? It's apples and oranges. It's either accepted or denied. It is what it is. So, again, liability cases versus comp claims, very different, should be treated very different. But when you're thinking about paying medical bills and making considerations around protecting Medicare's interest for future medical expenses, the first one is it related or is it not related? Someone's got to make that call. Is it Medicare allowable? Is it not Medicare allowable? What will Medicare pay for? Will they share in the cost of anything? What's the right fee schedule? What's the highest you could pay up to it? Technically, The only person, entity, quote unquote, that can pay at Medicare fee schedule rates is Medicare. However, it's not uncommon for a professional administrator to be able to do their jobs well to pay for expenses at or near the Medicare fee schedule. But again, you can't expect that from a layperson, so yet another virtue of having a professional administrator manage these accounts. Pricing. What's the right fee schedule? Is it a comp claim? Is it a liability case? Where does the individual live? Also, the frequencies at which you're going to be making these expenses, and you all have to attach dollar figures to them. Just a quick, rundown that managing these MSA accounts is not just paying bills when they come to your door. Think about the last slide here. Think about what would be tasked with someone. Now, we'll put this into the context of working with a special needs trust. You have a Medicare set-aside account. We've done all the diligence. You've made decisions. You've arrived at a dollar figure. You know what the number is, and you have an idea of what that account is intended for, right? What kind of expenses it's intended for. The MSA account, no matter how large or small it may or may not be, is always considered a countable resource. That means if you have an individual that's dual eligible, or they have some form of public benefit that's asset-based, they could not receive that settlement or the MSA amount without it jeopardizing their asset-based benefits. The MSA account must always be placed within the special needs trust. I know GSPT has a great trust document that I think was attached and everybody should have access to. I encourage you all to look through that and get yourself well acquainted with it if and when the situation should arise that you'll need to go through this navigation yourself. But conceptually, for the purposes of today, the MSA account is housed within the Special Needs Trust, a kind of a carve-out subtrust, if you will. And from there, will the trustee become the one to administer the MSA? Will the aunt or uncle? Will a banker, a money manager be asked to do it? The issue that comes up is we know that it's all about making proper distribution decisions, very similar to how you have to make proper distribution decisions to a special needs trust when it comes to quality of life and expenditures. This is all about proper distribution decisions for medical expenses, right? So if you can tap a professional administrator to handle the Medicare set-aside portion, you two can work in concert to manage the S&T, have the Medicare set-aside appropriately administered, and the nice byproduct of that, of having an MSA administrator kind of tethered to you, is any kind of medical expense now that may pop up, whether it comes from the MSA or not, now it comes on their shoulders to take care of and adjudicate on your behalf. Give you a quick example. Maybe an individual, there's 3 buckets to pay bills. They have an MSA, they have an S&T, and maybe some other form of insurance. Bills come in, and maybe the amount can't come from the MSA. So it will need to come from, let's just say, the trust for a quick example. If you can adjudicate that bill down and reduce it by 40%, you've just recycled 40% back into the trust. You preserved corpus, and you didn't really have to do anything as the trustee to realize that. That's the value of having that administrator not only handle the MSP compliance, take on the risk of dealing with the account appropriately, but you now also have somebody to advocate for your client for medical needs, deal with doctors, providers, and health plans, and coordinate benefits in totality, while you can worry about the quality of life and administering the trust, knowing that the medical component has been addressed and taken care of. So the quick graphic up here is just following the arrows. You have the MSP statute, right? The 5 primary plans of insurance, no double dipping is the concept. You're protecting Medicare's interests, so you have to make allocation decisions. It's all medical problems to solve for. You're making medical planning decisions, and there's all kinds of things that you can do to make sure that you're adequately protecting Medicare while straddling the line of not compromising or blowing up a settlement. Work with a professional to make those allocation decisions and offer you that guarantee so you know that you have essentially cheap insurance. If something goes wrong, you have someone to basically deal with Medicare on your behalf. Then it pivots to, once you have an adequate set-aside amount, it's all about bill paying capacity. You're paying medical bills. You're coordinating multiple plans of insurance. You're having to find homes for bills. Where will the bill be paid from? How well can you adjudicate it? Can it come from a set-aside? What are the confines of being able to pay for bills out of a Medicare set-aside? So on and so forth. Paying medical bills. And it's all done through a professional administrator. All roads lead back to having a professional administrator to give you the risk transfer for the stakeholders in the settlement, adequately protect Medicare's interest, and serve as a medical claims advocate for the injured party. So we're now, I think, at the questions section. I think I might just be toggling back here.
Yeah, well, actually, I've got it, so don't worry. Okay, well, anyway, I always learn something, Joe, every time we do this. And the other thing is we get into the questions here, and I think it's fair to say, and if this isn't, tell me, we'll edit this out, that if folks do have questions, I know you've been very good about answering questions here. So you've got the number of the whole thing.
Right.
Joe does get around, so it may take him 24 hours.
You're a kind man to say that.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so here's a couple of questions up here, and we're going to end just at 1 o'clock. So can you just elect not to use Medicare and buy private insurance and just say to hell with the whole damn thing?
Great question, and that it comes up all the time. So yes, what you've said is valid. That nothing you said is wrong. That is an option. However, be mindful of the appetite for risk that you're taking on with a decision like that. So you can certainly buy private insurance and say they're going to pick up the tab on these injury-related expenses, so Medicare is not going to pick up the tab. Boom, I'm good, right? There's nothing wrong with that. However, be mindful that will that insurance plan always be around? Will it lapse? Will a provider just accidentally send the bill on up to Medicare because, hey, they know that Medicare pays really low fees, but Medicare is really good at just paying for things, so they'll get paid as a provider. All sorts of things that can go south through, that are kind of out of your control when you're at the point of settlement trying to form a game plan to protect an individual's Medicare benefits, that the policy's gone, if it doesn't cover something, rejects it, if a provider just decides to send a bill to Medicare, all sorts of issues that pop up. What does that mean for protecting their Medicare benefits? There is no statute of limitations, for lack of a better term, meaning 6 months post-settlement, 6 years post-settlement, if Medicare all of a sudden finds that they're paying for medical bills that they should not be primary, you're likely going to get a letter eventually. They're a big bureaucracy. But what will happen is they'll go through and they'll pull these medical codes and match dollars to them and say, listen, we paid for X, Y, and Z, and we understand that you had an insurance settlement back in May of 2018 for X, Y, and Z injuries and body parts. We think that we should not have paid for these items. We're going to put the onus on you, and you can tell us where we went wrong, and you can defend it. But in the meantime, either it's going to turn into a lien, which is a major problem, or we're going to shut off Medicare benefits, which is a major problem. And we want to avoid those problems. And what we're trying to do here is form game plans with our attorney, clients, and protecting their clients to make sure they never run into any roadblocks or challenges that may present themselves down the road. And thinking about paying the Medicare bills, one of the items that kind of comes up with what you mentioned about just getting private insurance is, well, I just lost my train of thought. There you go. That's what I get for speaking for an hour.
Well, so back to that. That's easy enough to do here. So when they're looking at coming up with a number and all that, and as we all know, costs are just skyrocketing here. How do they factor in cost of living increases? That treatment today for $10,000 is probably going to be the $15,000 treatment tomorrow.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because if you kind of view through a lot of times that question comes up from somebody that's looking at this from like a financial lens, right? Whether they're a structured settlement consultant, or they're a settlement consultant that's doing financial planning for the individual. How do you take into account cost of a wheelchair today might not be the same cost 10 years from now. Medicare takes the view that there is no formal guideline, meaning depending on what nurse allocator, physician, anyone, you don't have to be a nurse or a physician to write these reports, but they probably should have that background more than not. Anyone that's writing a Medicare set-aside report, if you give them the same claim, the same medical records, it's basically they're putting themselves into that decision making process and not just following a rigid decision matrix that Medicare gives you. And one of the things that they don't give you when you're making these allocation decisions is a baked COLA. They don't give you one. It's basically up to your own your own best judgment. So to that, there is no black and white answer, but that is important when you're working with an allocator or somebody that's going to be valuing future medicals, whether it be through cost projection, life care plans, or taking pieces of those to form an MSA. You do need to take into account how you're going to make good on those medical needs 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road, because you're right. The cost of anything is going to go up, or it's going to move as time goes on. And you need to make sure that whatever you allocate for is paid at or below that amount indefinitely, right? Kind of my example before about if you allocate and use better fee schedules or rates on, let's just say, a wheelchair today, but then it turns out that you weren't going to administer that account after all, and a layperson does, well, now they can't go achieve that same price on the wheelchair that you allocated for, so they pay over what your allocation built in. That's a big problem. So it kind of goes hand in hand with just kind of valuing the cost of care and making sure that when it comes time to make good on that expense, you must pay at or below that fee schedule. But as far as a direct guideline on a COLA, Medicare's silent.
Okay, now Joe, if you choke on this, I'll step on you. I'll step in for you. Do you always have to put an MSA in a special needs trust?
Do you always have to put an MSA in a special needs trust?
Which would certainly be good for the Golden State Pool Trust, but
well, I'll answer that question with a question. Do you want to have Medicare benefits? Do you want to retain access to the current public benefits that you have? And if the answer is meh, then you have a lot of choices. But if the answer is no, I absolutely need to worry about my quality of care and I need to retain my benefits and make best use out of those public benefits with whatever I'm getting out of a settlement, yes, the MSA must always be placed inside of the special needs trust. Like I mentioned before, it's always considered a countable asset. Doesn't matter if it's $5,000 or $500,000, right? So it needs to be protected within the special needs trust.
So here would be the thing to look at, and I want to really emphasize for folks that are watching this, whether you're dealing with needs-based benefits or not, you really want to be knowledgeable, at least as far as what the issues are when it comes into MSAs. I will tell you, I monitor a lot of personal injury attorney listservs, and this question about MSAs come up all the time, as far as I can remember it can. So if you have a situation where somebody is trying to preserve their SSI, their Medi-Cal, Medicaid, IHSS, the problem with this is that, and I know there's actually been a case in another state that says contrary, but generally it's accepted that MSA is an available resource and could interfere with your Medi-Cal or Medicaid or SSI and that kind of thing. And that's where we normally put it in a self-settled special needs trust here. And so you should really be knowledgeable about this, because the attorneys, for instance, stepping out of the trustee shoes and stepping into as an attorney, I get questions from a lot of my referral sources about their confusion about MSAs and that kind of thing. Usually my answer will be, you really need to protect Medicare's interest, and if they start asking about specifics of the situation, usually I'll refer them to MediVest, which will help on this. So once again, what we have here, and we have a separate MSA trust which will hold the funds, and that will make sure that it's not an available resource for SSI, Medicaid, Medi-Cal in California, in-home support services, and that sort of thing. Now, one of the perplexing things, and you had talked about this, and I think one of the stupidest things about this is that they don't allow payment for the administration. So one of the things, if you read through the MSA trust, and why you would, I don't know, here you'll notice it just says over and over and over again, we're not paid for administration, we're not paying for administration. So how would we pay for the administration?
Yeah, so that is, that could turn into maybe like a panel discussion all unto itself in the right time. But you are right that the world we live in right now, the fees for administration, no matter how small or large they may be, cannot come from the MSA account itself. Um, all of our groups, our trade associations, and our Take the Hill events and all that good stuff. We keep pushing that rock uphill, trying to communicate to Medicare to say, listen, this whole MSP statute from 1980, right, was born out of the need to protect the Medicare coffers from insolvency. And they go, hey, if somebody's receiving an insurance settlement and they're getting compensated for medical care, but they're a Medicare beneficiary, some of those settlement dollars should be coming first and the Medicare coffer should be second. That's the idea. Who is better to execute on that promise, if you will? An injured layperson or a professional entity that's in the business of administering these accounts to successful completion? If you could move the needle of professionally administered accounts from self-administered hands to professional hands, you would see a greater uptick in compliance and thereby keeping people out of the coffers of Medicare for a longer period of time, which is the whole idea, what they're after. But Medicare, again, is very short-sighted, saying, well, only medical needs should come from the MSA and fees can't come from the set-aside. So we still keep working at that one. We keep plugging away, but who knows when we could finally get some traction to make that change. So when we do have to find a fee for administration, it can come from literally anywhere else, literally. And like I said before, and I touched about, the reversionary agreements, just be mindful if the payer all of a sudden wants to pay for administration. It's becoming a little more commonplace now, so don't necessarily think that as an adversarial move or something if they talk about wanting to have the MSA administered. A lot of times carriers are seeing the light now that protecting Medicare's interests is a long-term play, and perhaps they might be interested in decreasing some exposure themselves, so they might be willing to participate or share in the cost of administration. But it'll come from the settlement proceeds, it'll come from the trust, anywhere other than the MSA. But one note on that as well is if anyone out there, has worked with MSAs or have had their clients' MSAs administered, you've probably seen within the last couple years that the cost of administration has been, significantly reduced. So no longer is it such a major burden or roadblock to have these accounts administered and doing the right thing, because it doesn't cost an arm and a leg to do them. So hopefully it removes the financial piece away from doing the right thing and having these accounts professionally administered.
Okay, Joe, and I bet we could go on and on and on, but sadly we're coming to an end here. So, Joe, I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and once again the partnership between the Golden State Pool Trust and Medivest has been just great. I do really want to encourage folks here that if you have questions or you're looking at partnering here, really consider keeping Medivest on your speed dial or your Rolodex or whatever you have here. They've been a great partner to work with here. And with this, most of our beneficiaries that do have MSAs or in the MSA trust, we elected to do it as a separate trust. But basically, we treat it as one account. Different trusts might do something differently. Anyway, for those of you that are watching here now or in the future, consider hitting that subscribe button here so that you'll get notice of future programs. We'll make sure that we send out the materials to folks that are watching. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, there should be a link to where the materials are. If not, send an email to Shelley, Shelley, at gspt.org here, and we'll make sure we get that to you. For those of you that are watching for CLE credit, make sure you fill out the form with the two codes, send that into Shelley, and we should be able to process that and get you your credit back within 48 hours. Thank you very much,
Thank
Joe.
you.
And for the rest of you, have a great afternoon.
Thank you.